It was dusk by the time I arrived at the old farmhouse. I had been driving for hours, following vague directions scribbled on a crumpled piece of paper. The air was thick and sticky, clinging to my skin as I walked up the gravel path to the front door. I paused for a moment, feeling a strange chill settle over me despite the humid summer air. I'd come to find my sister, Sarah. 2 weeks earlier, I had received her last letter, scrawled and barely coherent. It mentioned something about the children of the light and a man called Brother Elijah. Her words were haunting, filled with fear and desperation. She begged me not to contact anyone, not to alert the authorities, and to come find her. It had taken me this long to track down this location, a sprawling compound miles from anything recognizable. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but the last thing I anticipated was silence. As I crossed the threshold into the darkened house, the only sounds were the faint creaks of the floorboards beneath me and the steady hum of my own heartbeat. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. There was no sign of Sarah, no sign of anyone. I had only her descriptions to go on, and they had been vague. A shadowy figure moved in the corner of my eye, and I spun around, finding myself face to face with an elderly woman, her eyes wide and hollow. Are you looking for someone?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Her gaze darted around, as if she expected someone to emerge from the shadows. "Sarah." "My sister," I said, gripping her arm, maybe harder than I should have. She winced, but didn't pull away. "Please, do you know where she is?" The woman nodded slowly, her eyes brimming with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe. Or maybe it was guilt. She reached out and squeezed my arm, her hand cool and clammy. "You need to leave," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "If Elijah finds you." "Where is she?" I demanded, a rising panic gripping my chest. "Please, I need to see her." The woman cast one last, fearful glance over her shoulder, then motioned for me to follow. She led me down a narrow corridor lined with flickering candles that cast long, eerie shadows along the walls. My footsteps echoed as we walked deeper into the house, into the belly of whatever twisted secrets it held. At last, we reached a small door at the end of the corridor. The woman paused, then turned to face me. I can't go in there," she murmured, her voice shaking. "Just find her, get her out of here, and don't look back." With that, she turned and vanished back down the corridor, leaving me standing alone in front of the door. My hand was trembling as I reached for the handle, my pulse racing. As I turned the knob, the door creaked open, revealing a dark, cramped room lit only by the faint glow of a single candle. And there she was, my sister, Sarah, sitting on the floor with her arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes vacant, as if she were staring through me. Her face was gaunt, her skin pale and sickly, but she was alive. "Sarah?" I whispered, moving toward her. She flinched, looking at me with a mixture of confusion and fear. Why did you come here?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "You shouldn't be here. Elijah, he'll find you. He finds everyone." I reached out, gripping her shoulders. "Sarah, we're leaving, now." But she shook her head, her expression desperate. "You don't understand. There's no leaving. He knows everything. He sees everything." Before I could respond, a creak echoed from behind me. I turned, my heart pounding, to see a tall, thin figure standing in the doorway. His face was half hidden in shadow, but his eyes were piercing, almost inhuman, filled with a cold, calculating malice. "Brother Elijah," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. He took a step forward, his gaze fixed on me, as if he could see right into the depths of my soul. "So you're Sarah's brother," he said, his voice smooth and chilling. I've heard so much about you." I felt a wave of dread wash over me as he closed the distance between us, his movements slow, deliberate. I could feel Sarah's grip on my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "You came here, seeking answers," he continued, his voice almost hypnotic. "But there are no answers here, only salvation." "Let us go," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. He smiled, a thin, cruel smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "Leave? Why would you want to leave when you've only just arrived?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial of clear liquid, holding it up to the flickering candlelight. "We're on the brink of enlightenment," he said, his voice low and reverent. "You'll want to stay for the final cleansing." I pulled Sarah to her feet, feeling her body tremble against mine. "We're not staying for anything," I said, backing toward the door. Brother Elijah's smile faded, his eyes narrowing. "You have no idea what you're up against," he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "No one leaves, no one escapes." Without another word, I dragged Sarah out of the room, down the corridor, my heart pounding as we sprinted towards the exit. The old woman's warning echoed in my mind, "Don't look back." But as we reached the front door, I couldn't resist a glance over my shoulder. There, standing in the shadows, was Brother Elijah, watching us with those cold, unblinking eyes. He raised a hand, and for a moment, I thought I saw him smile. A promise, a threat, that this wasn't over. We burst into the night, the cool air hitting us like a wave. We didn't stop running, not until we reached the car and sped away, the farmhouse fading into the darkness behind us. But even as we drove, my hands shaking on the wheel, I could feel his eyes on us, watching, waiting. I knew we had escaped, but something told me it was only a matter of time before Brother Elijah found us, because some shadows, once they touch you, never really let go. It all started with a single cryptic phone call from my sister, Jessica. She sounded different. Her voice was flat, distant, and yet eerily serene. She spoke about finding her true self, and how she was finally free from the weight of the world. It wasn't like her. Jess had always been grounded, practical, a bit of a cynic, so when she mentioned the path to enlightenment, I shrugged it off as some New Age fad she'd grow bored of in a month. But as days turned into weeks, I noticed the changes. She quit her job without warning, sold everything she owned, and moved into a secluded commune on the outskirts of LA. Our weekly calls turned sporadic, then non-existent. I went from being mildly annoyed to terrified in a matter of days. My parents didn't know what to do, and the police saw her decision as voluntary. "She's an adult," they said. "There's nothing we can do if she chooses to be there." That was the day I decided I'd have to bring her back myself. I left work early, my head buzzing with anxiety and dread. As I drove to the commune, thoughts raced through my mind. What if she was in some kind of danger? What if this path was more sinister than it seemed? When I arrived, I was struck by how ordinary it looked, like any other retreat center nestled in the hills. But the calm was unsettling, a kind of unnatural stillness that crept under my skin. A man at the gate, dressed in white robes, stopped me. His eyes had that vacant, glassy stare that made my stomach turn. "I'm here to see Jessica," I said. His face remained blank as he asked, "Are you a follower of Master Atma?" "I'm just here for my sister," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. After a tense silence, he led me through the complex to a large, sparsely furnished room. My sister stood by the window, her eyes fixed on the distance. When she turned to look at me, there was something alien in her gaze, like she was staring through me. "Mark," she said softly, "you shouldn't be here." Her voice was flat, as if rehearsed. I could feel the weight of eyes watching us. "Jess, this isn't you," I whispered, taking a step closer. "Come home with me. Mom and Dad are worried sick." But she pulled back, almost like she was afraid of me. "I'm finally at peace here. The path has shown me what really matters." Desperation took over. I couldn't leave her there, not like this. So I did the unthinkable. I told her I wanted to join the path, that I wanted to understand what she'd found here. Her face softened, a flicker of the sister I once knew. She seemed genuinely pleased as she led me to a meeting hall where followers sat in rapt silence, eyes locked on a man standing at the front. Master Atma. He was charismatic, tall and imposing, with piercing eyes that seemed to hold some dark secret. His voice was hypnotic as he spoke about shedding the ego, finding true enlightenment, and freeing oneself from the burden of the material world. I forced myself to stay quiet, to blend in, as he outlined a philosophy that grew darker with every word. Freedom from suffering, he intoned, comes only through absolute surrender. The followers murmured in agreement, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Over the next few days, I went deeper undercover. I attended their meetings, listened to Atma's twisted sermons, and watched as followers were pushed to their physical and mental limits. It started with seemingly harmless meditations that stretched hours. But then came the sleep deprivation, the humiliation, rituals, where members were berated until they broke down. They were instructed to sever ties with family and surrender everything, their belongings, their identities, their very will, to the path. One night, I saw Jessica in the courtyard, alone, her shoulders slumped. I approached quietly, my heart pounding. "Jess," I whispered, "we have to leave. This isn't enlightenment. It's abuse." Her face twisted with fear and anger. "You don't understand," she hissed. "I'm here because I want to be. They're helping me. I'm finally free." Her voice trembled, as if she were trying to convince herself. I knew I needed proof to pull her out. Over the next few days, I kept my phone hidden, recording everything. Atma's sermons, the harsh conditioning, the members being coerced into giving up their savings. It was risky, but I couldn't stop. I knew they were watching me, that even a hint of suspicion could mean the end. I couldn't fail. Jess's life depended on it. One night I was pulled from my cot by two followers and taken to a room where Master Atma waited. He stared at me with a cold, knowing smile. "Mark," he said slowly, "you're a very curious man." His voice was low, menacing. I felt trapped, every exit blocked by his disciples. "Do you think you can come here, pretend to be one of us, and walk away?" I was shaking, but I forced myself to look him in the eye. "Jessica is my sister," I said. "She doesn't belong here." His smile faded, and he took a step toward me, his eyes boring into mine. "Jessica has found the truth. You're just a shadow, clinging to the lies of the world." His voice grew louder, more intense. "She's freed herself from you, Mark, from all of you." I was thrown back into my cot, my mind racing, knowing I was in over my head. I had to leave, to get the evidence to the authorities, but leaving meant leaving Jess behind, even if only for a day. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a choice I wouldn't get to make twice. The next morning, as the group gathered for a sunrise meditation, I saw my chance. I slipped through the shadows, running until my lungs burned, the silence of the commune giving way to the noise of the city. I collapsed into my car, my hands shaking as I played back the recordings. Proof, evidence, enough to bring them down. But just as I was about to call the police, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You can never save her. She belongs to us now." A chill ran through me as I stared at the message. My sister was still trapped in him, in that nightmare, and Master Atma knew exactly where I was. I felt a strange, lingering pull when I first saw the pamphlet for the shepherd's flock. It promised a life of peace, a break from the chaotic grind, a refuge, it said, for families like yours. My wife, Susan, was equally taken in by the idea. She wanted a safe haven for Emily and Ethan, a place away from screens and pressures where they could just be kids. I didn't know then that this refuge would become our prison, a place of secrets, control, and fear. When we arrived in the countryside of rural Montana, the fields stretched endlessly under a clear blue sky. Shepherd David, the leader of the shepherd's flock, welcomed us with open arms. He was a tall man, silver hair, piercing eyes, and a voice that carried both kindness and authority. His sermons were simple, focused on finding peace in work and devotion, in living simply in service to God. At first, it was perfect. Our family had never felt closer. Days were filled with chores and laughter, nights with shared meals and stories around a fire. The community was like an extended family, and for the first time in years I felt I could breathe. Ethan and Emily ran wild in the open fields, free in a way that I hadn't been able to give them back home. We felt whole, and for a moment, it seemed we'd found everything we'd been searching for. But something changed over time. Shepherd David's sermons, once focused on unity and love, began to twist into something darker. He spoke of the evils of the outside world, warning us about its dangers and its attempts to corrupt our souls. He insisted that we could only find salvation through complete submission to his guidance. Independent thought, he said, was the devil's trap, a trick to lead us away from true enlightenment. Then, subtle restrictions started creeping in. They were small at first, a rule about when we could eat, which books we were allowed to read, and who we could talk to. I dismissed them as part of the discipline Shepherd David preached about. But when Susan started asking questions, things took a turn. She tried to voice her concerns to Shepherd David, and suddenly she was labeled divisive. People in the community began avoiding her, whispering as she passed by. They warned me that a wife's doubts were dangerous, that her rebellion could ruin the family's chance at salvation. Susan was isolated, her voice silenced. I began to notice other changes, too. The children's laughter faded. Their once bright faces grew shadowed. They were no longer allowed to play freely or even speak with kids outside the community. They were fed the cult's version of history, stripped of their innocent joy. Ethan and Emily became more fearful, and their questions, which once made me proud, became tinged with anxiety and doubt. One evening, Emily came to me in tears, clutching a bundle of letters she'd found hidden in an old barn. They were written by former members, people who had somehow escaped. The words on those pages twisted my stomach with dread. The letters were stories of control, manipulation, and abuse, hidden beneath the guise of salvation. They spoke of Shepherd David's demands for total obedience, his punishments for those who dared to resist, and the families he had torn apart, all in the name of faith. The words on those pages drove a nail into the picture of peace and unity I'd built in my mind. Shepherd David wasn't a benevolent leader. He was a predator, feeding on those desperate for purpose, using fear to keep us locked in his grip. I realized we were trapped, our lives caught in his web. I told Susan what I'd discovered, and we knew what we had to do. We needed to leave. But escape wasn't easy. Shepherd David had eyes everywhere, people devoted to him who watched for signs of disobedience. Leaving meant risking everything, including the lives of our children. We began planning in secret. waiting for the right moment, a time when we could slip away unnoticed. The longer we stayed, the more dangerous it felt. I saw how Shepherd David looked at me, a faint smile that seemed to say, "I know what you're thinking." He had a way of reading people, and it was clear he sensed something was amiss. The final straw came one night, when Ethan, exhausted and fearful, asked if we could go home. He said he missed his old bed, his friends, his school. I saw the fear in his eyes, a fear no child should feel. In that moment, I knew we had to leave. Immediately. We waited until the darkest hours, when the compound was quiet. Susan and I woke the kids, urging them to stay silent as we made our way through the fields under the cover of night. The darkness was thick, and every crunch of a twig sent my heart racing. I held Emily's hand tightly, glancing back to make sure Susan and Ethan were close. Just as we reached the edge of the property, we heard a voice, a low, cold whisper that echoed through the night. It was Shepherd David, standing in the shadows, watching us. "Leaving so soon?" His words slithered through the air, and I felt a chill run down my spine. In that moment, I felt something inside me snap. I couldn't let this man control our lives any longer. I grabbed a nearby rock and held it tightly, ready to defend my family if he tried to stop us. Shepherd David stepped forward, his face half lit by the moon, a sinister smile creeping across his lips. But then he stopped, as if sizing us up, before stepping back and watching as we hurried past him, his laughter echoing in the dark. We ran, our breaths harsh and loud in the quiet night. The fields seemed endless, stretching on as though the earth itself was holding us back. But we kept going, our legs burning, our hearts pounding, until finally we reached the main road. We flagged down a passing car, desperate and breathless, and the driver, sensing our urgency, took us to safety. It's been years now, but the nightmares still come. I wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, haunted by the sound of his voice, his laughter. Even now, in the safety of our new life, I feel his eyes on us. We escaped, but there are times when I wonder if we're truly free, or if he's still out there, watching, waiting.